There are men history remembers as heroes. There are men it recalls as villains. And then there are men like Andrew Jackson, men who refuse to be captured by either word, who walk through the pages of time leaving boot prints too deep to ignore and scars too permanent to heal. He was born in violence, raised by rage, and forged in a wilderness that did not forgive weakness. He killed men in duels over matters of honor. He defied presidents, challenged generals, and stared down death so many times that death itself seemed to grow weary of him. He was loved by millions who saw in him their own struggle, their own defiance. He was feared by those who understood what he represented, a force of nature wrapped in human skin, a storm given a name and a purpose. And when he became president, he did not simply govern. He transformed. He shattered. He remade the nation in his image, and the echoes of his choices still whisper through the corridors of American history, soft and terrible, like the wind before a coming storm. This is not a story of a perfect man. It is the story of a terrifying one. A man who believed so deeply in his own vision that he would burn everything in his path to see it realized. And tonight, as the darkness gathers gently around you, we walk beside him, through blood, through fire, through the wilderness of his soul. If these words carry you closer to sleep, let this channel stay by your side too. A gentle tap on subscribe keeps this voice with you, night after quiet night, as we wander together through the stories that shaped our world. Rest easy now. The journey has only just begun. The Carolinas in 1767 were not gentle. They did not cradle newborns with soft hands or whisper lullabies into the darkness. The land was raw, unfinished, a place where survival was earned daily and comfort was a luxury no one could afford. Into this unforgiving world, on March 15, Andrew Jackson entered existence already touched by tragedy. His father, also named Andrew, had died just weeks before, his body broken by the effort of clearing land, moving logs, building something permanent in a place that resisted permanence. The older Andrew Jackson collapsed one day and never rose again, leaving behind a pregnant wife and 2 young sons in a wilderness that did not pause for grief. Elizabeth Jackson, Andrew's mother, was left to raise 3 boys alone in a land that barely acknowledged women's strength, even as it demanded everything from them. She was Irish, born across the ocean in a place she would never see again, and she carried that heritage like armor, a stubbornness, a refusal to break even when breaking seemed inevitable. The family lived in the Waxhaws, a region that straddled the border between North and South Carolina, a place so remote that even the question of which colony claimed it remained uncertain. Here, among rough cabins and rougher men, young Andrew learned his first lessons. That the world was hard. That it gave nothing freely. That weakness invited suffering, and strength was the only shield worth carrying. He was not a frail child, but neither was he naturally robust. He was lean, wiry, with red hair that seemed to burn in the sunlight and eyes that carried a fierce intensity even in boyhood. His mother taught him to read from the Bible, the only book they owned, and he absorbed the stories of wrath and justice, of prophets who defied kings and nations that rose and fell according to divine will. These were not gentle bedtime tales, they were narratives of power, consequence, and the terrible cost of defiance. And young Andrew listened, absorbing them into his bones, letting them shape the contours of his understanding. The world was a place of struggle. God favored the strong. And mercy was something you extended only after victory was secured. The Waxhaws community was small, tight-knit, bound together by shared struggle and shared faith. People helped each other because they had to, because survival in that wilderness required cooperation. But they also competed, measured themselves against one another, kept careful tallies of slights and favors. Young Andrew learned to navigate this world, to understand its unspoken rules. He learned when to fight and when to hold his tongue, though he was never particularly good at the latter. Even as a boy, he had a temper, a quickness to anger that flared hot and bright, burning through caution and consequence alike. His mother worried about it. His relatives whispered about it. But Andrew could not seem to help himself. When something felt wrong, when someone pushed too far, the rage simply came, unstoppable as a summer storm. And then, in 1775, the world changed. News arrived slowly in the Waxhaws, carried by travelers and merchants, spreading like ripples across still water. The colonies were in rebellion. British rule was being challenged. Men were forming militias, taking up arms, preparing to fight for something they called independence. To young Andrew, barely 8 years old, these were abstract concepts, distant thunder on a far horizon. But the adults around him understood the stakes. War was coming. And in the borderlands, in places like the Waxhaws where loyalties were divided and tensions ran deep, war would not be a distant affair fought by strangers. It would come to their doorsteps. It would demand everything. The Revolutionary War reached the Carolinas like a slow-moving nightmare, and when it arrived, it brought horrors that no one had anticipated. This was not the clean, orderly conflict described in history books. It was brutal, personal, a civil war that set neighbor against neighbor, friend against friend. British forces moved through the region, but so did loyalist militias, and the violence between patriots and those who remained loyal to the crown became savage, intimate, unforgiving. Farms burned. Men were executed in front of their families. Accusations of treachery flew freely, and the line between justice and murder blurred until it disappeared entirely. Andrew was 13 when his oldest brother, Hugh, joined the Patriot militia. The decision was not remarkable. Many young men were enlisting, swept up in the fervor of rebellion and the promise of glory. Hugh Jackson marched away with his unit, and the family waited for news. It came in the form of a messenger, solemn-faced and weary, who brought word that Hugh had died. Not in battle, not in some heroic charge against British lines. He had succumbed to heatstroke during a march, his body simply giving out under the Carolina sun. There was no glory in it, no meaning that could be extracted and held up as consolation. He was gone, and the family was smaller, and the war ground on without pause. The loss hardened something in Andrew. He was old enough now to understand death, to grasp its finality and its randomness. And he was old enough to feel rage at the injustice of it, at a world that could take his father before his birth and his brother before his time. When British forces swept through the Waxhaws in 1780, Andrew and his remaining brother Robert joined the militia as couriers, boys playing at war because there were no longer enough men to do the fighting. They carried messages, tended horses, performed tasks that kept them near the action without placing them directly in its path. But proximity to war is its own kind of danger, and soon enough, that danger found them. The British dragoons came through the Waxhaws like a scythe through wheat, and in their wake, they left only devastation. It was April 1781, and Andrew was 14 years old enough to understand fear but too young to fully grasp the permanence of what was about to unfold. He and Robert had taken shelter in the home of a relative, hoping to wait out the British sweep through the region. But someone had talked, or perhaps the soldiers were simply thorough in their search. The door burst open, and suddenly the war was no longer something happening elsewhere, it was in the room, breathing down their necks, demanding submission. The officer who entered was young, his uniform still crisp despite the campaign, his authority absolute in that moment. He looked at the two Jackson boys with contempt, seeing in them not children but rebels, threats to be neutralized or humiliated. He ordered Andrew to clean his boots, to kneel down in the dirt and mud and polish them until they shone. It was a small cruelty, the kind that soldiers inflict when they hold all the power and want their enemies to know it. But Andrew Jackson, even at 14, even staring at a man with a sword and the full weight of the British Empire behind him, refused. The word came out sharp, defiant, a single syllable that hung in the air like a challenge. No. The officer's face darkened. He raised his sword and brought it down, not to kill but to maim, to teach a lesson that would be carried in scars. The blade sliced across Andrew's hand as he raised it instinctively to protect his head, cutting deep into the bone. Then it came down again, striking his skull, opening a wound that bled freely, painting his face red. The pain was immediate and overwhelming, but through it, Andrew felt something else, a rage so pure and focused that it burned away the fear. He would remember this moment for the rest of his life. He would remember the officer's face, the casual cruelty, the assumption that he could be broken. And he would carry the scars as proof that he had not been. Robert tried to intervene, and the officer struck him too, less severely but enough to draw blood. The brothers were taken prisoner, thrown onto a wagon with other captured patriots, and transported to a British holding facility in Camden. The conditions there were beyond grim, they were deliberately inhumane. Prisoners were crammed into small spaces with no sanitation, minimal food, and no medical care. Smallpox swept through the facility like wildfire, and men died daily, their bodies stacked outside until someone bothered to bury them. Andrew and Robert both contracted the disease, their bodies racked with fever, their skin erupting in lesions. Death seemed not just possible but inevitable, a mathematical certainty in a place designed to break both body and spirit. But Elizabeth Jackson was not a woman who accepted inevitability quietly. When she learned her sons were imprisoned, she set out on foot to negotiate their release. How she managed it remains unclear, perhaps she traded something of value, perhaps she appealed to a sympathetic officer, perhaps she simply wore down the resistance through sheer determination. But she succeeded. Andrew and Robert were released into her care, both barely alive, both burning with fever. She brought them home, 45 miles on foot, Robert so weak he had to ride while she and Andrew walked. The journey should have killed them. Somehow, it did not. They reached home, and for a brief moment, it seemed they might survive. But Robert's condition worsened. The smallpox had ravaged his system too thoroughly, and 2 days after their return, he died. Andrew lay in the next room, delirious with his own fever, drifting in and out of consciousness, unaware that his last brother was gone. When he finally recovered enough to understand, when someone gently told him that Robert would not be coming back, something inside him went cold. 2 brothers now. Both taken by the war. Both gone before they had truly lived. Elizabeth Jackson tended to her surviving son with fierce devotion, nursing him back from the edge of death through sheer will. It took weeks, but slowly, painfully, Andrew's fever broke. His strength returned in increments, each day a small victory against the disease that had claimed so many others. And when he was finally well enough to stand on his own, when the worst had passed and survival seemed assured, his mother made a decision. There were other prisoners, other sons of the Waxhaws being held on British prison ships in Charleston Harbor, dying in filth and neglect. She could not save them all, but she could try. She could bring medicine, blankets, whatever small comforts might ease their suffering. It was dangerous work, the kind that invited disease and hardship, but Elizabeth Jackson had never been one to calculate risk when duty called. She left in August 1781, and Andrew never saw her again. Weeks passed, then a month, then longer. News finally came in the form of a small bundle of her belongings, delivered by someone who had been with her when she died. Cholera had taken her, her body worn down by the journey and the exposure to disease. They buried her in an unmarked grave somewhere near Charleston, and no one could tell Andrew exactly where. There would be no headstone, no place to visit, no physical marker of her existence beyond his own memories. At 14 years old, Andrew Jackson was alone in the world. No father, no mother, no brothers. Just himself and the wilderness that had taken everything from him. The grief was overwhelming at first, a weight that pressed down on his chest and made breathing difficult. He moved between relatives, unwanted but tolerated, a boy without a place in a world that had no patience for weakness. And slowly, over the months that followed, the grief transformed into something else. Rage. A cold, focused anger that had no outlet but plenty of fuel. He blamed the British for his mother's death, for his brother's deaths, for every loss and humiliation his family had endured. But more than that, he blamed the world itself, its cruelty, its randomness, its refusal to offer justice or meaning. In the aftermath of loss, some people turn inward, seeking comfort in solitude and reflection. Andrew Jackson turned outward, hardening into something sharp and unyielding. The relatives who took him and found him difficult, restless, prone to outbursts that seemed disproportionate to whatever small slight had triggered them. He had inherited a modest sum from his grandfather's estate in Ireland, not a fortune, but enough to give him options, enough to make him feel, briefly, that he had some control over his fate. He moved to Charleston for a time, drawn to the city's energy and anonymity, and there he began to squander his inheritance with the recklessness of someone who had learned that nothing was permanent, that wealth and comfort could vanish as easily as family. He gambled. He drank. He spent money on fine clothes and horses, trying to dress himself in the trappings of a gentleman even as his behavior remained rough, unpolished, marked by the frontier that had raised him. Charleston society tolerated him because he had money, but they did not accept him, not truly. He was too raw, too obviously shaped by hardship, his edges too jagged to fit smoothly into their polished world. And when the money ran out, as it inevitably did, Charleston lost interest in him entirely. He was alone again, but this time without even the cushion of modest wealth to soften the fall. The experience taught him something crucial, something that would shape the rest of his life. Wealth without power was meaningless. Respect could not be bought, it had to be taken, earned through force of will and the refusal to back down. He needed a profession, a path forward that would give him not just survival but standing. And so, with few other options and a burning need to prove himself, Andrew Jackson decided to become a lawyer. Not because he felt any particular calling toward justice, but because the law offered a ladder, a way to climb out of obscurity and into relevance. He apprenticed himself to Spruce Mackey in Salisbury, North Carolina, studying in an office that smelled of old paper and tobacco smoke, reading texts that laid out the rules by which civilized society supposedly operated. The law, he discovered, was not so different from the wilderness. It had its own predators and prey, its own hierarchies and power structures. The difference was that violence here was channeled through language, through contracts and courtroom arguments, through the careful manipulation of rules that everyone pretended to respect. Jackson proved an adequate student, competent if not brilliant, absorbing what he needed to pass the bar examination while showing little interest in the philosophical underpinnings of jurisprudence. He did not care about justice as an abstract concept. He cared about winning. In 1787, at the age of 20, Andrew Jackson was admitted to the bar, and he immediately began looking westward. North Carolina still felt crowded to him, too settled, too bound by old families and established hierarchies. But beyond the mountains, in the territory that would become Tennessee, there was opportunity. The land was still wild, still being carved out of Cherokee territory through treaties and encroachments, and men with ambition could make names for themselves there. Jackson packed what little he owned and headed west, riding toward a future that existed more in his imagination than in any concrete plan. He arrived in Jonesboro first, practicing law in a small settlement where disputes were settled as often by fists as by legal arguments. Then he moved further west to Nashville, arriving in 1788 in a town that barely deserved the name. It was a collection of rough structures clustered near the Cumberland River, surrounded by forests that still held dangers both animal and human. The settlers who lived there were tough, suspicious, fiercely independent, and Jackson fit among them in a way he never had in Charleston or Salisbury. These were people shaped by the same forces that had shaped him: hardship, loss, the constant presence of violence. They did not care about his lack of pedigree or polish. They cared whether he could be counted on, whether he would stand when standing mattered. Jackson established himself quickly as a prosecutor, riding circuit through the wilderness to bring cases before whatever frontier court had jurisdiction. The work was dangerous. Travel meant exposure to bandits, hostile natives, unpredictable weather, and simple bad luck. But Jackson thrived on it, relishing the constant motion, the sense that he was building something even in the midst of chaos. He was not a particularly sophisticated legal mind, but he was relentless, refusing to let cases drop even when pursuing them seemed futile. And he had a presence, an intensity that juries responded to, a way of making them believe that the outcome of their verdict mattered not just legally but morally. He also began to accumulate land, buying parcels when he could, accepting it as payment for legal services, speculating on future value in a region where land was the primary form of wealth. This was not unusual. Every ambitious man in Tennessee was doing the same, gambling that settlement would continue, that the Cherokee would be pushed further west, that the federal government would eventually recognize Tennessee as a state and bring stability to land titles. Jackson's holdings grew, though not without complications, not without disputes over boundaries and ownership that would dog him for years. But each acre represented possibility, a tangible marker of his rise from orphaned poverty to something approaching respectability. And then he met Rachel Donaldson Robards, and everything became more complicated. She was married, though unhappily, trapped in a union with a man named Louis Robards who was by all accounts jealous, controlling, and prone to violent rages. Rachel had fled from him multiple times, seeking refuge with her family, trying to escape a marriage that had become unbearable. Jackson boarded with her family when he first arrived in Nashville, and the attraction between them was immediate, intense, dangerous. She was dark-haired and spirited, with a warmth that drew people to her and a sadness in her eyes that spoke of suffering endured. Jackson, for all his roughness, responded to that sadness with a fierce protectiveness. He saw in her someone who needed defending, and defending people was something he understood, something that gave him purpose. The situation was impossible, scandalous by any measure. Rachel was still legally married, and divorce was not only difficult but socially devastating in a frontier society that prized respectability even as it practiced violence. But Jackson did not care about scandal, he cared about Rachel, about claiming her and protecting her from the man who had hurt her. When word came that Robards had filed for divorce, Jackson and Rachel married, believing the legal proceedings were complete. They were wrong. The divorce had not been finalized, would not be finalized for 2 more years, which meant their marriage was technically invalid, which meant Rachel was living in adultery, which meant her reputation was ruined. The realization, when it came, was devastating. They remarried immediately once the divorce was final, trying to legitimize what had already occurred, but the damage was done. For the rest of their lives together, Rachel would be whispered about, accused of immorality, painted as a woman of loose virtue who had seduced a frontier lawyer away from proper society. And for the rest of his life, Andrew Jackson would carry the weight of that accusation like a stone around his neck, defending her honor with a ferocity that bordered on madness. Anyone who spoke ill of Rachel became his enemy, immediately and irrevocably. The slights would pile up over the years, feeding his rage, giving him targets for the anger that had been building since childhood. And that anger, patient and cold, would wait for opportunities to strike back. The wilderness had shaped him. War had scarred him. Loss had hollowed him out and filled the space with something hard and unyielding. And now love, complicated and controversial, gave him something to protect at all costs. Andrew Jackson at the end of his first chapter was no longer the orphaned boy from the Waxhaws. He was becoming something else entirely, a man who would not bend, who would not forget, who would carry every wound forward as fuel for whatever battles lay ahead. The night deepens now, and his story moves with it, into territory darker still. Tennessee in the 1790s was not yet a state, but it carried itself with the swagger of one. It was a place of becoming, a territory suspended between wilderness and civilization, where fortunes could be made by men willing to gamble on futures that existed only as ideas. Andrew Jackson threw himself into this world with the same intensity he brought to everything, building a law practice that was less about jurisprudence and more about enforcement. He collected debts for merchants, prosecuted cases against men who refused to pay what they owed, and became known as someone who would pursue a claim to its bitter end. His reputation grew not because he was brilliant, but because he was relentless, because when Andrew Jackson took a case, you knew he would not let it go until resolution was reached or all options were exhausted. The law in Tennessee was a blunt instrument, and Jackson wielded it accordingly. Court sessions were chaotic affairs, held in rough buildings or sometimes outdoors, with juries drawn from whoever happened to be available. Fights broke out regularly, both verbal and physical, and lawyers needed to be as comfortable with their fists as with their arguments. Jackson thrived in this environment, his frontier upbringing serving him well in a place where polish mattered less than presence. He won cases through sheer force of personality, staring down opposing counsel, intimidating witnesses, making juries believe that ruling against him would be a mistake they would regret. And when legal arguments failed, when someone pushed too far or insulted him too publicly, Jackson had other means of settling disputes. Dueling was not uncommon in the South, but Jackson embraced it with a fervor that went beyond social custom. For him, duels were not just about defending honor, they were statements, assertions of dominance, ways of establishing that he was not a man to be trifled with. The first recorded duel came in 1788, just after he arrived in Tennessee, when a fellow lawyer named Waitstill Avery made a comment Jackson found insulting. The challenge was issued, the terms agreed upon, and at the appointed time they met with pistols. Both men fired and both missed, either through poor aim or deliberate mercy. Honor was declared satisfied, and they parted ways. But the pattern was established. Jackson would answer insults with violence, formal and ritualized perhaps, but violence nonetheless. As his law practice grew, so did his land holdings, and with them came the complications that would shadow him for decades. Land speculation in Tennessee was a labyrinth of conflicting claims, disputed boundaries, and titles that rested on shaky legal foundations. Jackson bought land whenever he could afford it, sometimes paying cash, sometimes accepting it as payment for services, sometimes purchasing it on credit with the assumption that its value would rise. He believed deeply in the promise of Western expansion, in the idea that settlers would keep coming, that the Cherokee would be pushed aside, that Tennessee would fill up with ambitious people who needed land and were willing to pay for it. He was gambling on the future, and for a time, the gamble seemed to be paying off. But then the financial networks that undergirded these transactions began to unravel. Jackson had accepted payment from a Philadelphia merchant named David Allison, receiving promissory notes that he then used to purchase more land. When Allison's business collapsed, those notes became worthless, and suddenly Jackson found himself holding debts he could not pay and land whose value was uncertain. Creditors came calling, demanding payment, threatening legal action. Jackson, who had spent years collecting debts from others, now found himself on the other side of that equation, scrambling to satisfy obligations while protecting the assets he had accumulated. The experience was humiliating, frustrating, a reminder that wealth could evaporate as quickly as it appeared. He worked his way out slowly, selling parcels of land, negotiating with creditors, taking on more legal work to generate cash. The process took years and left him with a deep suspicion of banks, of paper money, of any financial system that seemed designed to benefit distant elites at the expense of common people trying to build something tangible. This suspicion would calcify into conviction, shaping his political views and eventually his presidency. But in the 1790s, it was simply a wound, a source of stress that made him even more prickly, even quicker to take offense when he felt his integrity was being questioned. Rachel remained his anchor through all of this, the one constant in a life defined by turbulence. They built a home together, first a simple cabin, then a more substantial plantation they called Hunter's Hill, acquiring slaves to work the land as was common among the rising planter class. Jackson's relationship with slavery was complex but not conflicted. He accepted it as a given, a natural part of the economic system he was trying to navigate. He treated his slaves with a paternalistic firmness, punishing infractions severely while considering himself a benevolent master. The moral contradictions that modern eyes see plainly were invisible to him, or at least unexplored. He had suffered greatly in his own life, but that suffering did not translate into empathy for those whose bondage was far more complete than anything he had endured. Rachel, meanwhile, bore the constant weight of her reputation, the whispers that followed her through Nashville society, the knowing looks from women who considered themselves more respectable. She withdrew increasingly into domestic life, finding comfort in her home, her garden, her husband's fierce devotion. Jackson's protection of her became almost obsessive, a lens through which he interpreted every slight, every political attack, every criticism. If someone mentioned Rachel's past, even obliquely, Jackson heard it as a mortal insult, one that demanded response. And he responded, again and again, with challenges, with threats, with violence barely restrained by the thin veneer of civilization. The accumulation of enemies was inevitable for a man like Andrew Jackson, and by the turn of the century, he had collected them like debts owed. Some were political rivals who disagreed with his positions on land policy or Indian relations. Others were business associates who felt cheated in transactions that Jackson believed were fair. And still others were simply men who had made the mistake of underestimating him, of assuming that his rough manners meant he could be dismissed or insulted without consequence. Each slight was catalogued, remembered, filed away for future reference. Jackson forgot nothing, forgave less, and the list of people who had wronged him grew longer with each passing year. In 1796, Tennessee achieved statehood, and Jackson was elected as its first representative to the United States Congress. It was a mark of how far he had risen, from orphaned boy to congressman, and he took his seat in Philadelphia with a mixture of pride and contempt. The capital was everything Tennessee was not: refined, cosmopolitan, full of men who spoke in measured tones and believed in compromise. Jackson lasted one term in the House before moving to the Senate, and he lasted barely a year there before resigning. He found the work tedious, the debates meaningless, the whole enterprise a theater of empty gestures performed by men who had never known real hardship. He was not built for legislative patience, for the slow grinding of political gears. He was built for action, for decisive moments where clarity emerged from conflict. He returned to Tennessee and threw himself back into his law practice and his land speculation, but also into something else: military service. He had been appointed a judge on the Tennessee Superior Court, a position that gave him standing and a salary, but his real passion lay with the militia. He became Major General of the Tennessee Militia in 1802, a largely ceremonial position that nonetheless gave him the title he would carry for the rest of his life. General Jackson. It suited him, resonated with something deep in his identity, the part of him that had gone to war as a boy and never fully returned. And though the militia saw little action in those years, though it existed mainly on paper and in occasional musters, Jackson took the role seriously, preparing for a conflict he sensed was coming even if he could not yet name its shape. The years between 1800 and 1812 were marked by a slow building of pressure, like storm clouds gathering on a distant horizon. Jackson's personal life found a rhythm. He and Rachel moved to a new plantation called the Hermitage, a sprawling property that represented his arrival into the planter elite. They never had children of their own, a source of quiet grief for both of them, but they adopted Rachel's nephew and raised him as their son, naming him Andrew Jackson Jr. The boy gave them purpose, a future beyond their own lives, and Jackson doted on him with a tenderness that few outside the family ever witnessed. But tenderness did not define Jackson's public persona, and it was in the public sphere that his capacity for violence continued to manifest. In 1803, he served as a second in a duel involving a man named Thomas Swan and a lawyer named Samuel Jackson, no relation. The duel went badly, and Samuel Jackson was killed, shot through the body while Andrew Jackson watched, his role as second meaning he bore some responsibility for ensuring the rules were followed. The death troubled him less than it should have, or perhaps it troubled him in ways he did not articulate, adding another layer to the calluses forming around his heart. Then came the Dickinson affair, and with it, the duel that would define Jackson's reputation as a man who could not be killed. Charles Dickinson was young, wealthy, accomplished, everything Jackson was not by birth. He was also an excellent shot, perhaps the best in Tennessee, known for his accuracy with a pistol. The quarrel between them began over a horse race, a bet that went wrong, and escalated through a series of increasingly bitter exchanges. But the real catalyst was Dickinson's comment about Rachel, a remark made in a tavern that questioned her virtue and implied that Jackson's marriage was improper. When word reached Jackson, his response was immediate and absolute. Dickinson would either retract the statement publicly or meet him on the field. Dickinson chose the field, and on May 30, 1806, the two men met in Kentucky, just across the Tennessee border where dueling laws were less stringent. The terms were agreed upon: 24 feet apart, pistols raised on command, fire at will. Jackson knew he was facing the superior marksman, knew that Dickinson would likely shoot first and shoot accurately. So he made a decision that was either brilliantly strategic or utterly insane, depending on perspective. He would let Dickinson fire first, absorb the shot if necessary, and then take his time to aim and return fire. It was a plan that required absolute nerve and a willingness to die if things went wrong. They took their positions. The command was given. Dickinson raised his pistol smoothly, aimed at Jackson's chest, and fired. The bullet struck true, hitting Jackson just above the heart, cracking ribs and lodging near his lung. Jackson staggered but did not fall, his left arm coming up instinctively to clutch his chest, his face going pale. Dickinson stepped back in shock, realizing the shot had not dropped his opponent, watching in horror as Jackson steadied himself and raised his own pistol. The seconds intervened briefly, ensuring Jackson had not violated the rules by firing before steadying, then stepped back. Jackson took his time now, ignoring the blood seeping through his shirt, ignoring the pain that must have been overwhelming, and aimed carefully at the man who had insulted his wife. He fired. The bullet struck Dickinson in the abdomen, tearing through organs, a mortal wound that killed slowly and agonizingly. Dickinson died that evening, and Jackson rode home with a bullet lodged permanently in his chest, too close to vital organs to be safely removed. He would carry it for the rest of his life, a physical reminder of the price he was willing to pay for honor, for Rachel, for the refusal to back down even when backing down meant survival. The duel shocked Tennessee society, not because it happened, duels were common enough, but because of its brutality, its cold calculation, the image of Jackson standing there bleeding and still taking careful aim. The bullet in his chest became part of his legend, one more scar in a collection that seemed to only enhance his mystique rather than diminish it. People whispered about it in taverns and parlors, debating whether Jackson was impossibly brave or simply inhuman, whether his refusal to fall was courage or something darker, a stubbornness so profound it bordered on madness. The wound never fully healed, causing him pain for the rest of his life, a dull ache that sharpened in damp weather or during moments of stress. But Jackson wore it like a badge, proof that he could endure what would break lesser men, that death itself had taken its best shot and failed to bring him down. Rachel wept when she learned what had happened, not just from relief that he had survived but from anguish at the whole affair, at the violence that seemed to follow her husband like a shadow. She begged him to stop dueling, to let insults pass unanswered, to value his life and their future together more than abstract notions of honor. And Jackson, in the privacy of their home, softened, promised he would be more careful, held her while she cried against his chest where Dickinson's bullet rested. But in his heart, he knew the promise was hollow. He could no more stop defending her honor than he could stop breathing. It was woven into his identity, inseparable from everything he believed about strength, manhood, and what it meant to protect the things you loved. The years that followed the Dickinson duel were marked by a restless energy, a sense that Jackson was waiting for something, preparing for a conflict he could feel approaching but not yet see clearly. He continued to build his plantation, expanding the hermitage, acquiring more slaves, establishing himself as a cotton planter of substance. The work suited him in some ways, it was tangible, results-oriented, something you could measure in bales and acres. But it also felt insufficient, a stage too small for the magnitude of ambition and rage that still burned inside him. He was 45 years old in 1812, already scarred and weathered, already carrying wounds that would have killed other men. And he was hungry still, for vindication, for purpose, for a chance to prove himself in arenas larger than courtrooms and dueling grounds. The nation itself was moving toward conflict, tensions with Britain escalating over trade restrictions, impressment of American sailors, and British support for Indian resistance to American expansion. War hawks in Congress pushed for confrontation, arguing that American honor demanded a response, that the young republic could not allow itself to be bullied by its former colonial master. Jackson followed these developments with keen interest, sensing opportunity in the gathering storm. When Congress finally declared war in June 1812, Jackson's response was immediate. He offered the services of the Tennessee militia, volunteering to lead 2,500 men wherever the government needed them, ready to fight at a moment's notice. But the moment did not come quickly. Months passed with no orders, no call to action, leaving Jackson and his volunteers in a state of frustrated readiness. The war was going poorly for the United States, Detroit had fallen, invasions of Canada had failed, and the government seemed paralyzed by incompetence and indecision. Jackson watched from Tennessee, his impatience building, firing off letters to officials demanding to know when his men would be used. Finally, in January 1813, orders arrived directing him to march his militia to Natchez and await further instructions. Jackson assembled his men with barely contained excitement, drilling them, preparing them, promising that they would see action, that they would prove Tennessee's worth to a nation that had largely ignored the Western territories. They marched south through winter cold and muddy roads, arriving in Natchez in February, and then, nothing. The orders that were supposed to be waiting for them did not exist. The military leadership had changed its mind, decided the militia was not needed after all, and sent word that Jackson should dismiss his men and return to Tennessee. The order was bureaucratic, casual, the kind of administrative decision made by men who had never marched through freezing rain or promised soldiers that their sacrifice would matter. Jackson read it and felt something inside him snap. He refused. He would not abandon his men hundreds of miles from home with no provisions and no compensation for their service. If the government would not honor its obligations, then he would march them home himself, at his own expense if necessary. The march back to Tennessee became an ordeal that earned Jackson a new nickname. He shared rations with his men, gave up his horse to those too sick to walk, pushed himself as hard as he pushed them, refusing to show weakness even as dysentery and exhaustion took their toll. The soldiers, watching their commander suffer alongside them rather than retreat into the privileges of rank, began calling him Old Hickory, tough as hickory wood, unyielding, impossible to break. The nickname stuck, spreading beyond the militia to the wider public, becoming synonymous with Jackson's identity. And when they finally reached Tennessee, having completed the march without losing a single man to abandonment, Jackson's reputation had been transformed. He was no longer just a duelist and a lawyer. He was a leader men would follow into hell because they believed he would walk through the fire with them. But the government's betrayal gnawed at him, adding fuel to his growing conviction that Eastern elites viewed the West with contempt, that men in comfortable offices made decisions without regard for the lives they affected. It was a feeling shared by many on the frontier, a sense that they were expendable, their sacrifices unappreciated, their loyalty taken for granted. Jackson gave voice to that resentment, articulating it in letters and speeches, positioning himself as a champion of ordinary people against a distant and indifferent government. It was a narrative that would serve him well in years to come, a story he told about himself that resonated because it contained truth, even if it simplified the complex reality of power and politics. He returned to the Hermitage exhausted but energized, the Natchez March having reminded him what he was capable of, what he could inspire in others. Rachel nursed him back to health, worrying over his declining physical condition. The old wounds were taking their toll, his body beginning to show the accumulated damage of a lifetime spent pushing past reasonable limits. But Jackson was not interested in rest, not when war still raged and opportunities for glory remained unrealized. He healed enough to function, then threw himself back into military affairs, convinced that his moment was coming, that history was about to call his name. And history, patient and inexorable, was indeed preparing to call. In the Creek Nation to the south, tensions were building toward explosion, and when violence finally erupted, it would be savage, total, and transformative. Andrew Jackson, scarred and hungry and relentless, would ride into that chaos and emerge as something new, not just a general, but a force that would reshape the nation's destiny. The night grows deeper now, and the next chapter waits in darkness, where blood and fire will forge a legend that cannot be undone. The Creek Nation was not a single unified entity but a confederation of towns and clans, bound by language and tradition but divided by beliefs about how to survive in a world being steadily consumed by American expansion. Some creeks, called the Lower Creeks, had adopted elements of American culture, farming techniques, trade relationships, even Christianity in some cases, believing that accommodation was the path to survival. Others, particularly the Upper Creeks and those influenced by the Shawnee leader Tecumseh, believed that accommodation was surrender, that the only hope lay in resistance, in reclaiming traditional ways and pushing back against the encroachment that came year after year, treaty after broken treaty. These resistors were called Red Sticks, named for the war clubs painted red that became their symbol, and by 1813 their patience had run out. The spark that ignited the Creek War came in July 1813, when a group of Red Sticks returning from Pensacola, where they had received weapons and encouragement from the Spanish, were attacked by American militia. The Red Sticks retaliated in August, descending on Fort Mims, a stockade in southern Alabama where settlers and mixed-race families had taken refuge. What happened there was slaughter, pure and complete. The Red Sticks overwhelmed the inadequate defenses and killed nearly everyone inside, men, women, children, over 250 people cut down in a fury of violence that shocked the frontier. Reports of the massacre spread quickly, details growing more horrific with each retelling, and the public outcry was immediate and overwhelming. Someone had to respond. Someone had to punish the perpetrators and restore order. And in Tennessee, Andrew Jackson knew his moment had finally arrived. He was still recovering from a brawl, of all things, when the news reached him. In September 1813, just weeks before Fort Mims, Jackson had gotten into a gunfight with Thomas Hart Benton and his brother Jesse in a Nashville hotel. The dispute stemmed from a duel Jackson had seconded, and the Bentons felt Jackson had dishonored them. When they encountered each other in the hotel, violence erupted instantly. Jesse Benton shot Jackson, the bullet shattering his left shoulder and lodging in the bone. Jackson nearly died from blood loss, the doctors discussing amputation before deciding to leave the bullet in place. He was still bedridden, his arm in a sling, his shoulder packed with poultices, when word of Fort Mims arrived. He rose immediately, ignoring medical advice, ignoring the pain that must have been excruciating, and began organizing a response. Within days, Jackson had mobilized the Tennessee militia, calling up 2,500 men to march against the Red Sticks. His arm hung useless, still bleeding through the bandages, but he sat his horse and addressed his troops with a voice that carried absolute conviction. They would march into Creek territory. They would find those responsible for Fort Mims. And they would deliver justice so severe, so complete, that no one would ever again doubt the cost of attacking American settlers. The men responded with enthusiasm, eager for revenge, for glory, for the chance to take land and plunder under the banner of righteous retaliation. Jackson did not discourage these motivations. He understood that wars were fought by men with mixed motives, and purity of purpose was less important than unity of action. The campaign began in October 1813, Jackson leading his army south into territory that was barely mapped, where supply lines were tenuous and the enemy could strike from any direction. Almost immediately, problems emerged. The government had promised provisions that did not arrive. Food ran short, then ran out entirely, forcing the troops to forage and hunt just to survive. Men began to grumble, then to openly discuss desertion, arguing that they had signed up for a short campaign and were not obligated to starve in the wilderness. Jackson responded with a combination of persuasion and threat, promising that supplies were coming, that their sacrifice would be remembered, and that anyone who tried to desert would be shot. He was not bluffing. When a militia unit announced they were leaving, Jackson positioned loyal troops with loaded muskets and personally blocked their path, daring them to try to get past him. They backed down, awed or intimidated or both, and the army stayed together. In November, Jackson struck his first major blow against the Red Sticks at the town of Talladega. His forces surrounded the Creek warriors who had gathered there, and in the battle that followed, over 200 Red Sticks were killed while Jackson's casualties remained relatively light. It was a decisive victory, but also a preview of the brutality that would characterize the entire campaign. Jackson did not take prisoners if he could avoid it, did not allow time for negotiation or surrender. The Red Sticks were to be destroyed, eliminated as a military force, and anything that delayed that objective was unwelcome. His men, many of them frontiersmen with their own grievances against Indians, followed his lead enthusiastically, burning towns, destroying food stores, leaving devastation in their wake. But victory brought new problems. The militia's enlistment terms were expiring, and men began demanding to go home, arguing they had fulfilled their obligations. Jackson refused to let them leave, insisting the campaign was not finished, that abandoning it now would render their sacrifices meaningless. When an entire brigade threatened mutiny, Jackson had a cannon loaded and aimed at them, his hand on his sword, his face a mask of cold fury. He told them they could march home over his dead body, but if they tried it, many of them would die first. The confrontation lasted hours, tension so thick it seemed the air itself might ignite, and finally the men backed down again. But Jackson knew he was losing control, that exhaustion and hunger were eroding the discipline he had worked so hard to maintain. Reinforcements arrived in January 1814, bringing fresh troops but also new complications. These were not militia but regular army soldiers and volunteers from Tennessee and other states, men who had not marched with Jackson through the worst of the campaign and who did not yet understand his methods or his expectations. Among them were soldiers who questioned his authority, who saw him as a militia general playing at command, who did not believe his reputation matched reality. Jackson set about educating them quickly, establishing discipline through example and punishment in equal measure. When a young soldier named John Woods was caught sleeping on guard duty, Jackson convened a court-martial. The verdict was death. Woods was executed by firing squad, shot in front of the assembled troops as a lesson in what happened when orders were disobeyed. The execution shocked many. Guard duty violations rarely resulted in death sentences, but Jackson was unmoved. Discipline, he believed, was not negotiable. Without it, armies dissolved into mobs. The campaign ground on through winter, and Jackson's health continued to deteriorate. His shoulder wound refused to heal, leaking pus and blood, the pain constant and draining. He ate little, slept less, driving himself with the same merciless energy he demanded from his troops. Those close to him worried he would die before the campaign ended, that his body would simply give out under the accumulated strain. But Jackson kept moving, kept planning, kept pushing toward the final confrontation he knew was coming. The Red Sticks had retreated to a fortified position at Horseshoe Bend, a peninsula formed by a loop in the Tallapoosa River, where they had constructed a defensive barricade and gathered their warriors for a last stand. If Jackson could break them there, the Creek War would effectively be over. On March 27, 1814, Jackson's army arrived at Horseshoe Bend with over 2,000 troops, along with Cherokee and Lower Creek allies who had sided with the Americans. The Red Stick position was formidable. The barricade was 8 feet high, made of logs and packed earth, with firing positions that gave the defenders clear lines of sight. Behind them, the river offered escape if the position became untenable. Jackson studied the defenses and decided on a two-pronged assault. His artillery would pound the barricade from the front while Cherokee warriors swam across the river to attack from the rear, cutting off retreat and creating chaos. It was a sound strategy, but success would require his troops to storm the barricade in the face of heavy fire, to climb over those logs while bullets and arrows tore into them. The battle began at mid-morning with a cannon barrage that did little actual damage but made a tremendous noise, announcing that the final confrontation had arrived. Then the Cherokee crossed the river, their presence in the Red Stick rear creating panic and confusion exactly as Jackson had planned. And then came the order to charge. Jackson's troops rushed forward, screaming, firing, dying as they ran toward the barricade. The Red Sticks fought with desperate courage, knowing they were defending not just a position but their way of life, their families, their future. The fighting was intimate and terrible, men grappling hand-to-hand once the barricade was breached, knives and tomahawks flashing in the sun, blood turning the ground to mud. The battle lasted 5 hours, and when it ended, the Red Stick resistance was annihilated. Over 800 Creek warriors lay dead, their bodies scattered across the battlefield and floating in the river. Jackson's casualties were relatively light in comparison, fewer than 50 killed, but the human cost was staggering regardless of which side you counted. Among the American troops who distinguished themselves that day was a young officer named Sam Houston, who took 3 arrows during the assault and survived to become a legend in his own right. But the day belonged to Jackson, who had achieved exactly what he set out to do. The Red Sticks were broken, their power shattered, their ability to resist American expansion destroyed. In the aftermath of Horseshoe Bend, Jackson imposed a treaty on the Creek Nation that was punishing beyond measure. The Treaty of Fort Jackson, signed in August 1814, stripped the Creeks of 23 million acres, more than half their traditional territory. The land was taken not just from the Red Sticks who had fought, but from the Lower Creeks who had allied with the Americans, a betrayal that demonstrated Jackson's view of Indian relations with brutal clarity. He did not distinguish between friendly and hostile Indians when it came to land. All of them were obstacles to American settlement, and obstacles were to be removed. The Creeks signed the treaty because they had no choice, their military power destroyed, their people starving, their leaders understanding that refusal would mean total annihilation. Jackson emerged from the Creek War as a national hero, celebrated in newspapers across the country as the general who had avenged Fort Mims and broken Indian resistance in the South. He was promoted to Major General in the regular army, given command of the 7th Military District, and tasked with defending the Gulf Coast from British attack. Because the War of 1812 was still ongoing, and Britain, having defeated Napoleon in Europe, was now turning its full attention to the American conflict. Fresh troops were being dispatched across the Atlantic, and military planners believed the Gulf Coast, particularly New Orleans, would be a primary target. Jackson was ordered to defend it, and he prepared for the assignment with the same intensity he brought to every task, understanding that this would be the test that defined his legacy. But before New Orleans, there was one more lesson he needed to teach, one more demonstration of his unwillingness to tolerate challenges to his authority. In December 1814, with his army stationed in New Orleans preparing for the British assault, 6 militiamen deserted. They were caught, tried by court-martial, and sentenced to death. Jackson approved the sentences immediately, and on the morning of their execution, he made sure every soldier in the army was assembled to watch. The 6 men were shot simultaneously, their bodies left on display as a reminder that desertion, cowardice, or disobedience would be met with death regardless of circumstances. It was harsh, arguably excessive, but entirely consistent with Jackson's belief that discipline was the foundation of military success. New Orleans in late 1814 was a city balanced on the edge of catastrophe, a cosmopolitan port where French, Spanish, American, and Creole cultures mixed in an uneasy alliance, and where the approach of a massive British fleet inspired more panic than confidence. The city's defenses were inadequate, its militia largely untrained, and its citizens divided over whether to fight or negotiate. Into this chaos rode Andrew Jackson in December, still gaunt from the Creek campaign, still carrying bullets in his body from duels and brawls, still radiating an intensity that made men believe impossible things could be achieved through sheer force of will. He took command of a disparate collection of forces, regular army units, militia from Tennessee and Kentucky, free men of color, Choctaw warriors, and even pirates led by Jean Lafitte who agreed to fight for the Americans in exchange for pardons. It was not an army in any conventional sense. It was a gathering of armed men with different languages, different loyalties, and different reasons for being there. Jackson's job was to turn them into a force capable of stopping the most powerful military in the world. The British fleet arrived in mid-December, carrying over 10,000 professional soldiers, veterans of the Napoleonic Wars, men who had fought across Europe and now saw this American campaign as a simple mopping-up operation before returning home. They were commanded by experienced officers who had defeated Napoleon's marshals, and they approached New Orleans with confidence bordering on contempt. The Americans they would face were frontier rabble, untested and poorly equipped, led by a militia general whose reputation meant nothing against British discipline and firepower. It should have been a straightforward victory, another jewel in Britain's crown as it reasserted dominance over its former colonies. But Andrew Jackson did not fight straightforward battles. He fought with every advantage he could scrape together, every trick he could devise, every ounce of desperation he could channel into tactical advantage. He established his main defensive line along the Rodriguez Canal, a dried waterway that provided a natural barrier about 5 miles south of the city. His engineers, and every soldier who could swing a shovel, worked day and night to build earthworks behind the canal, creating a fortified position that stretched from the river on one side to swampy forest on the other. The work was backbreaking, conducted in winter cold and mud, but Jackson drove them relentlessly, knowing that every foot of earthwork raised their chances of survival. Behind those walls, he positioned his artillery, precious cannons that had been scraped together from the city's defenses and Lafitte's pirate stockpiles, and he drilled his riflemen endlessly on firing in formation, reloading quickly, making every shot count. The British probed his defenses throughout late December and early January, testing for weaknesses, launching small attacks that were repulsed with casualties on both sides. Jackson responded to each probe personally, writing the lines, encouraging his men, adjusting positions, refusing to sleep while the enemy remained active. His staff watched him wear himself down to nothing, subsisting on coffee and willpower, his body visibly failing even as his mind remained sharp. They worried he would collapse before the main battle arrived, but Jackson seemed sustained by something beyond physical needs, as if the sheer importance of the moment was feeding him energy that flesh alone could not provide. The main British assault came on January 8, 1815, in the cold pre-dawn darkness. Over 5,000 British soldiers advanced in tight formation toward the American earthworks, marching through morning mist that rose from the ground like ghosts. They were magnificent in their discipline, their red coats bright against the gray dawn, their officers on horseback directing the advance with calm precision. They expected the Americans to break and run when faced with this display of professional military power, this wall of bayonets moving in perfect rhythm. Instead, they met withering fire from behind those earthworks, a sustained barrage of cannon and rifle fire that turned the open ground into a killing field. Jackson's defensive position was brilliant in its simplicity. The British had to cross open ground with no cover, advance through cannon fire, then face riflemen protected by earthworks. The attackers were exposed at every step while the defenders remained largely hidden. And Jackson's troops, for all their lack of formal training, could shoot. The Tennessee and Kentucky riflemen in particular were devastatingly accurate, picking off British officers with calm precision, reloading and firing with a speed that British soldiers, trained in volley fire, could not match. The battle became a massacre, wave after wave of British soldiers advancing into fire, falling in rows, their bodies piling up as the assault continued with grim determination. The British commander, General Pakenham, was killed leading a charge, shot from his horse and dead before he hit the ground. His second-in-command was mortally wounded minutes later. The third-in-command finally called off the assault after realizing that continuing meant the complete destruction of his army. In less than 30 minutes of main combat, the British had suffered over 2,000 casualties, killed, wounded, or captured. Jackson's losses were 13 dead and 39 wounded. It was not just a victory. It was a humiliation, a demonstration that British military supremacy was not absolute, that American forces, properly positioned and properly led, could defeat the most experienced soldiers in the world. News of the victory spread across the United States like wildfire, arriving in cities and towns where citizens had grown weary of defeats and stalemates, where the War of 1812 had dragged on with little to celebrate and much to regret. And suddenly there was this, New Orleans, an impossible triumph, a battle that should have been lost but was won through American grit and the leadership of a general who would not accept defeat. Andrew Jackson became an instant national hero, his name spoken with reverence, his face appearing in newspapers and broadsides, his story told and retold until it achieved mythic proportions. He was the general who had done what no one else could, who had taken a ragtag collection of defenders and turned them into a force that humbled the British Empire. What few knew at the time, what would only become clear weeks later, was that the Battle of New Orleans had been fought 2 weeks after the Treaty of Ghent officially ended the War of 1812. The treaty had been signed in Belgium in December, but news traveled slowly across the Atlantic, and neither Jackson nor the British commanders knew the war was over when they fought. It should have rendered the battle meaningless, a tragic waste of life over a conflict already resolved. But history does not work that way. The victory mattered because people believed it mattered, because it gave Americans a narrative of triumph when they desperately needed one, because it made Andrew Jackson into something larger than a man, a symbol of American strength, American defiance, American exceptionalism. He returned to Tennessee as a conquering hero, welcomed with parades and speeches, praised by politicians who had ignored him just months before. Rachel wept with relief to have him home alive, having spent the war years in constant terror that he would die in some distant battle and she would be left alone. Jackson held her and promised that the fighting was done, that he would stay home now and focus on their life together. But even as he made the promise, he knew it was not entirely true. The fighting might be done for now, but the ambition remained, the hunger for something more, the sense that his story was not yet complete. The war had made him famous, but fame was just a beginning. And in the quiet of the Hermitage, as winter turned to spring in 1815, Andrew Jackson began to understand that his destiny lay not just in military glory, but in political power, the kind that could reshape a nation according to his vision of what it should be. The night deepens further now, and the path ahead leads toward even more complex territory, where the hero becomes something more troubling, where victory gives way to decisions that will haunt the nation for generations. The next chapter waits in shadows darker still. The years following New Orleans should have been peaceful for Andrew Jackson, a time to rest in the glow of military triumph and enjoy the rewards of fame. But peace was never something Jackson wore comfortably, and by 1817 he was already restless, already looking for new battles to fight. His opportunity came in the form of the First Seminole War, a conflict born from the chaos of the Florida border, where Spanish authority was weak and Seminole Indians raided into Georgia with impunity. President James Monroe gave Jackson broad orders to pursue raiders but to respect Spanish sovereignty, diplomatic instructions that Jackson interpreted with characteristic flexibility. He invaded Florida with overwhelming force, captured Spanish forts, executed 2 British subjects he accused of inciting Indian attacks, and effectively conquered the territory for the United States. It was audacious, possibly illegal, and completely successful. Spain, unable to defend Florida and unwilling to go to war over it, sold the territory to the United States in 1819. Jackson had expanded American territory through force of will and a willingness to ignore diplomatic niceties when they stood in his way. His actions in Florida sparked a political firestorm. Critics in Congress accused him of starting an unauthorized war, of executing prisoners without proper authority, of acting like a military dictator rather than an officer following civilian leadership. Henry Clay, a powerful senator from Kentucky, led the charge against him, arguing that Jackson's behavior threatened the constitutional order and set a dangerous precedent for military commanders operating without oversight. Jackson responded with fury, seeing the attacks as personal betrayals and political maneuvering by men who resented his popularity. He never forgave Clay, adding him to the long list of enemies who would feel his wrath in years to come. But the public loved what Jackson had done, seeing in his Florida campaign the same boldness that had won New Orleans. He had taken action while politicians debated, achieved results while diplomats dithered. He was a man who got things done, and in a young nation still proving itself, that quality mattered more than constitutional niceties. In 1821, Jackson was appointed military governor of Florida, tasked with overseeing the transfer of power from Spain to the United States. He held the position briefly, long enough to establish American authority and make clear that Florida would be governed by American laws, not Spanish traditions. Then he resigned, citing poor health and a desire to return home to Rachel. He was 54 years old, his body deteriorating from decades of accumulated damage, the bullets still lodged in his chest and shoulder, chronic dysentery that left him weak and in pain, headaches that could be debilitating. He seemed to be winding down, accepting that his military career was over and that the rest of his life would be spent at the Hermitage as a respected elder statesman. But Tennessee's political leaders had other plans. They believed Jackson's popularity could translate into political power, and in 1822 they arranged for the state legislature to nominate him for president. Jackson initially resisted, claiming he had no interest in politics, that he was too old and too sick for the demands of a campaign. But the nomination stayed on the table, and gradually Jackson began to see it differently, began to understand that the presidency was not just another office but the ultimate vindication, the final proof that a boy from nothing could rise to the highest position in the land. He allowed his name to go forward, and in 1824 he entered the presidential race against a crowded field that included John Quincy Adams, Henry Clay, and William Crawford. The 1824 election was unlike anything that had come before, a chaotic multi-candidate affair that exposed deep divisions in American politics. Jackson won the popular vote and the most electoral votes, but he did not achieve the majority required for outright victory. The decision went to the House of Representatives, where Clay, who had finished fourth, threw his support to Adams in exchange for being named Secretary of State. Adams won the presidency, and Jackson exploded with rage, denouncing what he called the corrupt bargain, a backroom deal that had stolen the presidency from the will of the people. He believed it absolutely, felt the betrayal as a physical wound, and he spent the next 4 years preparing for another run, building a political organization dedicated to his return and revenge. The campaign for 1828 began almost immediately, and it was vicious from the start, a descent into personal attacks that shocked even seasoned political observers. Jackson's opponents brought up every scandal from his past: the duels, the executions during the Creek War, the invasion of Florida. But their most effective and most cruel weapon was Rachel. They resurrected the story of her first marriage, the confusion over divorce dates, painting her as an adulteress and Jackson as a man who had knowingly lived in sin. Newspapers printed accusations that grew more lurid with each retelling, suggesting that Rachel had abandoned her first husband to run away with Jackson, that their marriage was a sham, that she was morally unfit to be First Lady. Rachel, who had lived quietly at the Hermitage for decades, who had avoided public life whenever possible, was devastated by the attacks. She read the newspapers even when Jackson begged her not to, saw herself described in language so hateful it seemed impossible that human beings could direct such venom at someone they had never met. Jackson watched his wife suffer and felt helpless in a way he had never experienced before. He could fight men, could challenge them to duels, could destroy them on battlefields. But he could not protect Rachel from words, from the slow assassination of her character that played out in print across the nation. He raged against his opponents, swore vengeance, promised that those responsible would pay. But the attacks continued, relentless and merciless, until Rachel stopped going to church, stopped leaving the Hermitage, stopped believing she could survive the scrutiny that came with being married to a man who sought power. The election of 1828 was a landslide. Jackson won decisively, carrying states across the South and West, bringing out voters who had never participated before, men who saw in him their own struggles and aspirations. It was a triumph of popular democracy, a repudiation of the elites who had denied him 4 years earlier, vindication for every slight and betrayal he had endured. Jackson should have been celebrating, preparing for his inauguration, savoring the sweetness of victory after years of bitter campaigning. Instead, he was planning a funeral. Rachel Jackson died on December 22, 1828, just weeks after the election, her heart giving out under the accumulated weight of stress and sorrow. She was 61 years old, and she died knowing her husband had won but would enter the White House without her. Jackson was inconsolable, his grief so profound that those close to him feared he might not survive it. He held her body and wept openly, something he had not done since childhood, his iron control shattered by loss too great to contain. At her funeral, he stood by the grave and spoke not to the assembled mourners but to Rachel herself, promising her that he would honor her memory, that he would make those responsible for her suffering pay for what they had done. He blamed his political enemies for her death, believed absolutely that the stress of the campaign attacks had killed her as surely as a bullet. And he carried that belief with him to Washington in March 1829, a widower dressed in black, his face gaunt with grief, his eyes carrying a hardness that unnerved even his supporters. The inauguration was unlike any before it. Thousands of ordinary citizens descended on the Capitol, flooding the streets, pushing into the White House after the ceremony, tracking mud across fine carpets, breaking glassware, overwhelming the staff who had prepared refreshments for a much smaller crowd. The chaos was shocking to Washington society, a breach of decorum that seemed to confirm their worst fears about Jackson and the rabble he represented. But to Jackson's supporters, it was perfect, a demonstration that the people's house truly belonged to the people, that the age of aristocratic government was over. Jackson entered office with a clear sense of his enemies, not just political opponents but anyone connected to the old order, the established elites who had looked down on him, questioned his wife's virtue, tried to deny him power. He began systematically replacing federal appointees with his own supporters, a practice that became known as the spoils system. To the victor go the spoils, and Jackson distributed government positions to those who had supported his campaign, believing that rotation in office prevented corruption and ensured that government remained responsive to the people. His critics called it patronage, corruption, the death of professional civil service. But Jackson saw it as democracy in action, breaking the hold of entrenched interests and opening government service to ordinary citizens. His cabinet was chosen as much for loyalty as competence, and almost immediately it fractured over a social scandal that echoed Rachel's suffering. Peggy Eaton, the wife of Jackson's Secretary of War John Eaton, was ostracized by Washington society, accused of having an affair before her first husband's death, painted as a woman of loose morals unfit for polite company. The accusations were familiar, almost identical to those leveled at Rachel, and Jackson reacted with furious defensiveness. He championed Peggy Eaton publicly, demanded his cabinet members' wives accept her socially, turned what should have been a minor social controversy into a political crisis. When they refused, when Vice President Calhoun's wife led the opposition to Peggy's inclusion, Jackson saw it as a continuation of the attacks on Rachel, another instance of hypocritical elites using morality as a weapon against those they deemed beneath them. The Eaton affair, as it became known, consumed the first 2 years of Jackson's presidency, distracting from policy and creating factions within his administration. Eventually, Jackson reorganized his entire cabinet, forcing out those who would not support Peggy Eaton, surrounding himself with advisors who understood that loyalty to Jackson meant accepting his judgments without question. His critics called this new group the Kitchen Cabinet, implying they were unofficial advisors who met in secret rather than proper government officials. But Jackson did not care about propriety, he cared about surrounding himself with people he trusted, people who would not betray him as so many others had. His first major policy battle came over the Second Bank of the United States, a powerful financial institution that Jackson believed represented everything wrong with American government. The bank was controlled by Eastern elites, its president Nicholas Biddle wielding enormous economic power without being elected or accountable to the people. Jackson saw it as a corrupt monopoly that enriched the wealthy at the expense of ordinary citizens, that manipulated currency and credit to serve its own interests rather than the nation's welfare. He had hated banks since his own financial troubles in Tennessee, and the Second Bank became the embodiment of everything he opposed: concentrated power, Eastern elite control, the use of government to benefit the few at the expense of the many. Biddle and the bank's supporters believed they were untouchable, that the bank's economic importance made it politically invulnerable. They pushed for early recharter of the bank in 1832, hoping to force Jackson into either signing the bill or vetoing it before an election and alienating moderate voters who supported the bank's stability. It was a calculated political move that badly misread Andrew Jackson. He vetoed the recharter bill with a message that was less legal argument than populist manifesto, declaring the bank unconstitutional despite the Supreme Court having ruled otherwise, attacking it as a threat to democracy and equality, positioning himself as the defender of common people against moneyed interests. The veto was extraordinary, both in its reasoning and its rhetoric. Previous presidents had used the veto sparingly, generally only when they believed legislation was clearly unconstitutional. Jackson used it as a policy weapon, asserting that his interpretation of the Constitution mattered more than the Supreme Court's, that he was not bound by judicial precedent when he believed fundamental principles were at stake. His opponents were horrified, seeing in this a dangerous expansion of executive power, a president who believed he was above the law. But Jackson's supporters loved it, seeing a president who would fight for them, who would use every tool at his disposal to break the power of entrenched elites. The bank war, as it became known, consumed Jackson's presidency and transformed the nature of executive power in ways that still echo through American government. After his veto, Jackson won re-election in 1832 decisively, interpreting his victory as a mandate to destroy the bank completely. He did not wait for its charter to expire, he moved to kill it immediately by withdrawing federal deposits and placing them in state banks that his opponents mockingly called pet banks. His Treasury Secretary refused to carry out the order, believing it exceeded presidential authority. Jackson fired him. The next Treasury Secretary also refused. Jackson fired him too. The third Treasury Secretary, Roger Taney, finally complied, and federal funds began flowing out of the Second Bank and into state institutions that were more sympathetic to Jackson's vision. The Senate, led by Henry Clay and Daniel Webster, responded by censuring Jackson, an unprecedented rebuke declaring that he had overstepped his constitutional authority. Jackson was furious, writing a formal protest that asserted the president was the direct representative of the American people, more so than Congress, and therefore had not just the right but the duty to act according to his interpretation of their will. It was a radical expansion of presidential power, claiming a popular mandate that superseded constitutional checks and balances. The censure eventually would be expunged from the record after Jackson's supporters gained control of the Senate, but the damage was done, or the transformation was complete, depending on perspective. Jackson had fundamentally altered the presidency, turning it from first among equals into a dominant force that could challenge and defeat the other branches when it believed itself acting on behalf of the people. The second bank did not survive. Its influence waned as federal deposits disappeared, its ability to regulate currency and credit evaporated, and by the time its charter expired in 1836, it was a shadow of its former power. Jackson had won, achieving exactly what he set out to do, destroying an institution he believed was corrupt and dangerous. But the victory came with costs. The removal of federal deposits and the proliferation of state banks led to economic instability, easy credit that fueled speculation, particularly in Western lands. The problems would not fully manifest until after Jackson left office, when the Panic of 1837 plunged the nation into economic depression. But the seeds were planted during his war on the bank, in the destruction of a stabilizing financial institution without creating adequate regulatory structures to replace it. Jackson's presidency was marked by these kinds of contradictions: bold action that achieved stated goals while creating unforeseen consequences, popular policies that empowered some Americans while devastating others. Nowhere was this more evident than in his approach to states' rights and federal power. He positioned himself as a champion of state sovereignty, a believer in limited federal government and the rights of states to govern themselves. But when South Carolina attempted to nullify federal tariff laws in 1832, declaring them unconstitutional and unenforceable within state borders, Jackson responded with fury and threats of military force. The nullification crisis brought him into direct conflict with Vice President John C. Calhoun, who supported South Carolina's position and believed states had the right to nullify federal laws they deemed unconstitutional. Jackson saw nullification as treason, a direct threat to the Union that had to be crushed before it spread. He pushed through the force bill, authorizing him to use military power to enforce federal law, while simultaneously supporting a compromise tariff that would ease South Carolina's complaints. The dual approach worked: South Carolina backed down, the crisis passed, and the Union remained intact. But the episode revealed Jackson's complicated relationship with federal power. He opposed it when it served elite interests like the bank, but embraced it when necessary to preserve the Union. The consistency was not in his constitutional theory but in his belief that he knew best what the nation needed. His supporters called him Old Hickory, celebrating his toughness and his refusal to bend. His enemies called him King Andrew, depicting him in political cartoons wearing a crown and trampling the Constitution. Both images contain truth. Jackson was tough, unyielding, a force that reshaped American politics through sheer personality and will. But he was also autocratic, intolerant of opposition, willing to expand executive power far beyond previous limits when he believed the cause justified it. He saw himself as the embodiment of the people's will, and anyone who opposed him was opposing democracy itself, a position that made compromise difficult and enemies permanent. Throughout his presidency, his health continued to decline. The old wounds never healed, and new ailments appeared. His vision deteriorated, his hands trembled, his body seemed to be slowly shutting down under decades of accumulated damage. He relied increasingly on younger advisors, particularly Martin Van Buren, his vice president during his second term, grooming him as a successor who would continue Jackson's policies. He also spent more time thinking about his legacy, about how history would remember him, about whether he had accomplished what he set out to do when he left the Hermitage all those years ago. His answer, in his own mind at least, was yes. He had broken the bank, preserved the Union, expanded American territory, opened government service to ordinary people, and transformed the presidency into an office of real power rather than ceremonial leadership. He had fought every battle that mattered to him, defeated every enemy who stood in his way, proved that a man from nothing could rise to everything. The cost of these victories, the constitutional precedents, the economic instability, the people destroyed in his path, did not weigh heavily on him. He had done what he believed was right, what the people wanted, what history demanded. But there was one more cost, one more consequence of his presidency that dwarfed all the others, one decision that would stain his legacy more than any duel or bank war or constitutional crisis. It involved the Cherokee Nation, the Creek and Choctaw and Chickasaw and Seminole, the indigenous peoples whose lands stood in the way of American expansion. And it involved a choice Jackson made that was deliberate, calculated, and catastrophic in its human toll. As his presidency moved into its final years, as he prepared to step down and return to Tennessee, this choice loomed larger and darker than anything else he had done, a shadow that no amount of political victory could dispel. The night grows heavy now with what comes next, with suffering inflicted not in the heat of battle but through the cold machinery of policy, with a trail that leads through tears toward a reckoning that Andrew Jackson would never fully face. The question of what to do with the Native American nations occupying lands east of the Mississippi had haunted American policy since the nation's founding, a moral and practical dilemma that successive administrations had addressed with varying degrees of humanity and honesty. Some, like Thomas Jefferson, had advocated for assimilation, believing native peoples could be incorporated into American society if they adopted European agricultural practices and Christian religion. Others had pushed for treaties that recognized tribal sovereignty while gradually purchasing land through negotiation. But Andrew Jackson had never believed in these halfway measures, these attempts to accommodate people he viewed as obstacles to American destiny. He had fought Indians his entire adult life, had killed them in battle, had taken their land through conquest and treaty, and he believed the only solution was removal, total, complete, and permanent. Jackson's views on Native Americans were shaped by his frontier upbringing and his military campaigns, experiences that taught him to see them not as fellow human beings with legitimate claims to their ancestral lands but as enemies to be defeated and displaced. He did not hate them in the way one might hate a personal adversary. His hatred was colder, more abstract, the kind that allowed him to order their destruction while believing he was acting in everyone's best interest, including their own. He genuinely believed that native peoples could not survive in proximity to American settlement, that contact with white civilization would destroy them through disease, alcohol, and cultural dissolution. Better, he reasoned, to move them west of the Mississippi where they could live as they wished, away from the corrupting influences of American society, preserved in some vast reservation where they would not interfere with progress. This reasoning ignored several inconvenient truths. Many native nations, particularly the Cherokee, had adopted exactly the kind of assimilation policies that previous administrations had encouraged. They had developed written constitutions, established schools, converted to Christianity, adopted European farming methods, and built permanent towns with homes and businesses. The Cherokee Nation had its own newspaper, published in both English and Cherokee using a written alphabet developed by Sequoyah. They had a legal system, a legislature, and diplomatic relationships with the federal government that were supposed to be protected by treaties. They were, by any measure, doing exactly what American policymakers had claimed they wanted native peoples to do. And it made no difference to Andrew Jackson. Georgia wanted Cherokee land, particularly after gold was discovered there in 1829, and the state began passing laws extending its jurisdiction over Cherokee territory in violation of federal treaties. The Cherokee appealed to the federal government for protection, citing the treaties that guaranteed their sovereignty. Jackson refused to intervene, tacitly supporting Georgia's actions while publicly maintaining that he could not interfere in state matters. It was a transparent fiction. Jackson had threatened military force against South Carolina during the nullification crisis, proving he would defend federal authority when he chose to. But defending Cherokee treaty rights did not serve his purposes, did not advance the goal of removing native peoples from lands that white settlers wanted. The Cherokee fought back using the one weapon they believed Americans would respect, the law. They took their case to the Supreme Court, arguing that Georgia's extension of state law over their territory violated federal treaties and the Constitution. In 1832, in the case Worcester v. Georgia, Chief Justice John Marshall ruled in favor of the Cherokee, declaring that Native American nations were distinct political communities with rights to self-government, that state laws had no force within Cherokee territory, and that only the federal government could negotiate with native nations. It was a complete legal victory, a vindication of everything the Cherokee had argued. And Andrew Jackson ignored it. The famous quote attributed to Jackson, "John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it, may be apocryphal, but it captures the essence of his response. He had no intention of using federal power to protect the Cherokee, regardless of what the Supreme Court ruled. The decision was legally binding but practically meaningless without presidential enforcement, and Jackson simply refused to act. Georgia continued extending its jurisdiction, harassing Cherokee citizens, preparing to seize their land, and the federal government did nothing to stop it. The Cherokee watched their legal victory turn to ash, understanding too late that laws only mattered when those in power chose to honor them. In 1830, even before the Supreme Court ruling, Jackson had pushed through Congress the Indian Removal Act, legislation authorizing him to negotiate treaties that would exchange native lands in the East for territory west of the Mississippi. The debate in Congress was fierce, with opponents arguing that removal violated existing treaties, contradicted promises made to native nations, and represented a moral failure of the highest order. But Jackson's supporters controlled enough votes, and the act passed narrowly, giving the president the authority he wanted. Jackson presented removal as voluntary, as a choice native nations could make freely. But everyone understood the reality: accept removal and receive compensation, or refuse and face state laws designed to make their continued existence impossible, with no federal protection to shield them. The Choctaw were the first to go, signing the Treaty of Dancing Rabbit Creek in 1830 and beginning their journey west. The conditions were terrible from the start: inadequate supplies, corrupt contractors who stole provisions, harsh weather, and routes that led through swamps and wilderness. Thousands died during the migration, from disease, exposure, and starvation. Those who survived arrived in Indian Territory to find conditions little better, forced to build new lives in unfamiliar land with insufficient resources. The Choctaw removal was a preview of what was to come, a demonstration that the promises of humane relocation and generous compensation were lies, that removal was a death sentence delivered slowly. The Creek Nation followed in 1832, though their removal was complicated by fraud and violence that made even the Choctaw experience seem organized by comparison. Land speculators descended on Creek territory like locusts, using forged documents and corrupt officials to claim individual allotments, leaving Creek families homeless even before the official removal began. When some Creeks resisted, fighting back against the theft of their lands, the military was called in to suppress what was labeled a Creek uprising. Hundreds of Creek warriors were put in chains and marched west in what amounted to a forced march of prisoners, while their families followed in separate groups, the nation fractured and traumatized by the chaos of their dispossession. The Chickasaw negotiated their own removal treaty, using the leverage of careful diplomacy to secure better terms than other nations had received. They were allowed to send scouts west to select their own territory, to supervise their own migration, to maintain some control over the process. Even so, the journey was brutal, the mortality rate high, the arrival in Indian Territory marked by the same shortages and hardships that plagued the other removals. But at least the Chickasaw had agency in their own tragedy, a small mercy in a process designed to strip native peoples of all control over their destinies. The Seminole in Florida refused to go peacefully, and their resistance sparked the Second Seminole War, a brutal conflict that dragged on for 7 years and cost the United States millions of dollars and thousands of casualties. The Seminole fought using guerrilla tactics in the Florida swamps, inflicting defeats on American forces, refusing to accept the inevitability of their removal. Eventually, through a combination of military pressure, deception, and exhaustion, most Seminole were captured or surrendered and were sent west. But some never left, retreating deeper into the Everglades where the army could not follow, maintaining a presence in Florida that endures to this day. Their resistance was costly, both to themselves and to the American forces sent against them, but it demonstrated that removal was not inevitable if people were willing to fight and die rather than accept displacement. And then there were the Cherokee, who had done everything right, who had assimilated and litigated and negotiated, who had received a Supreme Court ruling in their favor and still found themselves with no protection, no recourse, no choice but to accept the inevitable. A small faction of Cherokee, led by Major Ridge and his family, signed the Treaty of New Echota in 1835, agreeing to removal in exchange for $5 million and the promise of land in Indian Territory. The majority of Cherokee, led by Principal Chief John Ross, rejected the treaty, arguing that the signers had no authority to speak for the nation, that the agreement was fraudulent and should be voided. The Senate ratified the treaty anyway, and President Jackson declared it binding on all Cherokee. The Cherokee were given 2 years to leave voluntarily, but most refused, clinging to the hope that somehow justice would prevail, that the American government would honor its treaties and Supreme Court rulings, that they would not actually be forced from lands they had occupied for generations. That hope died in 1838, when President Martin Van Buren, Jackson's hand-picked successor, ordered the military to begin forced removal. 7,000 federal troops under General Winfield Scott entered Cherokee territory with orders to round up every Cherokee and prepare them for the journey west. The process was swift and merciless. Soldiers appeared at Cherokee homes with bayonets fixed, giving families only minutes to gather possessions before being marched to stockades. Those who resisted were dragged out by force. Those who moved too slowly were prodded with rifle butts. Homes were ransacked as soon as families were removed, white settlers and soldiers looting anything of value, burning what remained. Crops were left unharvested in the fields. Livestock was stolen or killed. Graves were robbed for jewelry. Within weeks, the Cherokee nation that had existed for centuries was reduced to a collection of prisoners in military stockades, waiting for their forced march to begin. The conditions in the stockades were appalling. Thousands of people crammed into small areas with inadequate sanitation, insufficient food, contaminated water. Disease spread rapidly in the overcrowded conditions, particularly among children and the elderly. People died waiting to begin a journey that would kill many more. Chief John Ross, who had fought removal through every legal and political channel available, found himself in a stockade with his people, his wife alongside him, both of them prisoners of a government that had promised to protect them. The first groups were sent west during the summer of 1838, transported by river and land routes that maximized efficiency while minimizing humanity. The heat was intense, water sources were scarce, and the pace was punishing. People collapsed from exhaustion and were left behind to die or catch up if they could. The sick were sometimes abandoned, deemed too weak to complete the journey. Children died in their mothers' arms. The elderly simply stopped walking and waited for death. Those who survived the journey arrived in Indian Territory traumatized, sick, and heartbroken. John Ross negotiated to lead the remaining Cherokee removals himself, hoping to organize the process more humanely, to give his people some dignity in their displacement. The military agreed, and Ross supervised the formation of 13 groups that would make the journey during the fall and winter of 1838 to 1839. He hoped the cooler weather would be easier on the travelers. Instead, it brought new horrors: freezing temperatures, snow and ice, inadequate clothing and shelter. The routes led through states that offered no sympathy, past white settlers who sometimes helped but more often watched with indifference or satisfaction as the dispossessed native people struggled past. The journey covered over 1,000 miles, much of it on foot, through terrain that varied from muddy bottomlands to frozen mountain passes. The Cherokee walked in groups of 1,000 or more, escorted by conductors who were supposed to provide supplies but who often arrived with less than promised, their contracts having been awarded to the lowest bidder with predictable results. Wagons carried the sick and elderly, but there were never enough wagons, and people too weak to walk were sometimes left to die by the roadside, burial parties following behind to inter the bodies in shallow unmarked graves. The dead were mourned quickly if at all. There was no time for proper ceremony, no opportunity to grieve in the manner their culture demanded. John Ross's wife, Quatai, insisted on giving her blanket to a sick child during a freezing night crossing of the Mississippi River. She developed pneumonia and died shortly after, one more casualty among thousands, her death a personal tragedy within a national catastrophe. Ross buried her and kept moving, leading his people westward because stopping meant more would die, because the only way through suffering was forward. His grief was private, carried alongside the collective grief of a nation being destroyed not through military defeat but through policy deliberately designed to break them. The mortality rate on what became known as the Trail of Tears was catastrophic. Estimates vary, but most historians agree that approximately 4,000 Cherokee died during the removal process, roughly 1/4 of the entire nation. Some died in the stockades, some on the trail, some shortly after arrival from diseases contracted during the journey. The exact number will never be known because records were incomplete and many deaths went unrecorded, bodies buried in unmarked graves, families fractured with no one left to remember all who were lost. Those who survived arrived in Indian Territory to find a land that was unfamiliar, already partly occupied by Cherokee who had removed earlier, contested by other tribes who had their own claims, and lacking the infrastructure to support the sudden arrival of thousands of refugees. The Trail of Tears was not an accident, not an unfortunate consequence of policies designed with good intentions. It was the deliberate result of choices made by Andrew Jackson and continued by his successor, choices rooted in the belief that native peoples had no right to remain on lands that white Americans wanted, that treaties could be broken when they became inconvenient, that Supreme Court rulings could be ignored when they contradicted executive preferences. Jackson's justification, that removal was for the native people's own good, that it would preserve them from the corrupting influence of white settlement, was a lie he may have told himself but which fooled no one who witnessed the reality of forced marches and mass graves. By the time the last Cherokee groups arrived in Indian Territory in 1839, Andrew Jackson had been out of office for 2 years, retired to the Hermitage where he lived as an elder statesman, his health failing but his mind still sharp. He followed political developments closely, corresponded with allies, offered advice to those who sought it, and maintained his belief that everything he had done as president had been necessary and right. When asked about Indian removal, he expressed no regret, no second thoughts. He believed he had solved the problem that had plagued the nation since its founding, that he had opened millions of acres to white settlement and development, that he had been bold where others had been timid. He did not travel to Indian Territory to see the refugees arriving sick and starving. He did not visit the graves that lined the trail west. He did not speak with the mothers who had lost children or the chiefs who had watched their nations destroyed. His understanding of removal was abstract, theoretical, based on reports that emphasized orderly relocation and minimized suffering. Or perhaps he simply chose not to see, not to acknowledge the human cost of policies he had championed. Either way, the Trail of Tears stands as his most enduring legacy, the decision that defines him more than his military victories or his expansion of presidential power. The Hermitage in his final years was a place of contradictions, like the man who owned it. Jackson lived there surrounded by slaves who worked his plantation, their labor providing the comfort and prosperity of his retirement. He was kind to some of them, by his own paternalistic standards, but he bought and sold human beings when it suited him, and he never questioned the institution that made his lifestyle possible. He had adopted a Creek orphan during the Creek War, a child whose parents he had killed, raising the boy at the Hermitage and educating him alongside his own adopted son. The gesture was simultaneously compassionate and monstrous, saving one child while destroying the culture that child came from. He maintained correspondence with political allies and enemies alike, his letters showing a mind still engaged with national affairs even as his body deteriorated. The old wounds continued to cause pain, the bullets still lodged in his chest and shoulder throbbed constantly, dysentery plagued him with increasing frequency, and he suffered from edema that made breathing difficult. He was slowly drowning in his own fluids, his heart weakening, his body finally succumbing to decades of damage it had somehow survived. But he remained mentally alert almost to the end, reading newspapers, receiving visitors, offering opinions on the political controversies of the day. He watched with satisfaction as his policies were continued and expanded, as more territory was added to the United States, as American settlement pushed ever westward. The Panic of 1837, the economic collapse that followed his war on the bank, troubled him less than it might have. He blamed his enemies for sabotaging his financial policies rather than acknowledging that destroying a stabilizing institution without creating adequate replacements had consequences. His capacity for self-reflection had never been his strength, and in old age it diminished further. He had been right about everything that mattered, had fought the good fight, had triumphed over enemies foreign and domestic. That was the story he told himself, and he believed it completely. His health crisis came in June 1845, his body finally reaching the limits of its endurance. He had survived bullets and disease and physical punishment that should have killed him a dozen times over, but now at 78 years old, the accumulated damage could no longer be overcome through sheer will. He gathered his household around him, family, friends, slaves who had served him for decades, and prepared for death with the same straightforward acceptance he had brought to other challenges. He had lived the life he chose, fought the battles he wanted, achieved the power he sought. He expressed satisfaction with his accomplishments and regret only for the enemies who had escaped his vengeance. On June 8, 1845, surrounded by those who had been closest to him, Andrew Jackson died at the Hermitage. His last words, according to those present, were simple and revealing: "I hope to meet you all in heaven, both white and black." Even in death, his worldview remained unchanged, the acceptance of racial hierarchy as natural and divinely ordained, the assumption that salvation was available to all but within a structure that preserved earthly distinctions. He died believing he had lived righteously, that his actions had been justified, that history would remember him as a hero who had expanded democracy and strengthened the nation. And in many ways, history has obliged him, at least partially. The funeral was enormous, drawing thousands of mourners from across Tennessee and beyond. People lined the roads to watch his coffin pass, veterans of his military campaigns stood in silent tribute, politicians delivered eulogies that praised his courage and his dedication to the common man. He was buried beside Rachel in the garden of the Hermitage, finally reunited with the woman whose memory had driven so much of his fury, whose suffering he had spent his life trying to avenge. The grave was marked with a simple monument, nothing grandiose, reflecting Jackson's stated preference for modest memorials. But the simplicity of the marker belied the complexity of the man it commemorated. Andrew Jackson's legacy is impossible to summarize neatly, impossible to reduce to hero or villain, impossible to understand without grappling with profound contradictions. He expanded democracy for white men while presiding over catastrophic policies toward Native Americans and maintaining the institution of slavery. He championed the common man while accumulating wealth and power that placed him among the elite. He defended the Constitution when it served his purposes and ignored it when it constrained him. He was capable of great personal loyalty and tenderness toward those in his inner circle, and of remorseless cruelty toward those he deemed enemies. He suffered genuine hardship and used that suffering to justify the suffering he inflicted on others. His expansion of presidential power fundamentally altered American government, establishing precedents that every subsequent president has either built upon or struggled against. The idea that the president is the direct representative of the people, more so than Congress, and therefore entitled to exercise broad authority in their name, this was Jackson's innovation, and it remains contentious nearly 2 centuries later. His use of the veto as a policy weapon rather than a constitutional check, his assertion that his interpretation of the Constitution mattered as much as the Supreme Court's, his willingness to ignore judicial rulings when they conflicted with his objectives, these were expansions of executive power that alarmed his contemporaries and should still give us pause. His Indian removal policy was ethnic cleansing by any reasonable definition, a deliberate program to forcibly relocate entire nations from their ancestral lands, implemented with callous disregard for human suffering and justified through a combination of racism and manifest destiny. The Trail of Tears was not an unfortunate accident but the foreseeable and indeed foreseen consequence of policies Jackson championed. Thousands died, cultures were shattered, and Jackson never expressed meaningful regret. This alone should complicate any celebration of his presidency, should force a reckoning with the human cost of his vision for America. His war on the Bank of the United States was popular politics and arguably sound democratic theory. Why should a private institution wield such enormous power over the nation's economy without electoral accountability? But the destruction of the bank without creating adequate regulatory structures to replace it contributed to economic instability that harmed many of the common people Jackson claimed to champion. His opposition to paper money and credit was rooted in his own bitter experiences with financial speculation, but it ignored economic realities of a growing nation that needed stable currency and credit systems. His economic policies were driven more by personal grievance than by sophisticated understanding of finance, and the consequences included a depression that devastated the very constituencies he claimed to represent. His personal violence, the duels, the executions, the casual brutality toward subordinates who questioned his authority, was extreme even by the standards of his time. That he carried bullets in his body was not evidence of courage so much as evidence of a man who created so many violent confrontations that eventually he was bound to be shot. His defense of Rachel's honor was understandable as personal devotion, but it manifested as a decades-long campaign of vengeance against anyone who mentioned her past, a disproportionate response that suggests deep psychological wounds that never healed. And yet, millions of Americans genuinely loved him, saw in him their own struggles and aspirations, believed he was fighting for them against elites who viewed them with contempt. This was not false consciousness or manipulation. Jackson did expand political participation for white men, did challenge entrenched economic interests, did speak to and for people who had been largely excluded from power. The Democratic Party he helped create became a vehicle for working-class political participation, even as it also became a defender of slavery and Indian removal. The contradictions were not incidental but central to Jacksonian democracy. The expansion of rights for some required or at least accompanied the oppression of others. Modern assessments of Jackson have grown increasingly critical as historians have centered the experiences of those he harmed rather than focusing solely on his expansion of white male democracy. The Trail of Tears cannot be dismissed or minimized as simply a product of its time. There was substantial opposition to removal even then, and Jackson had alternatives that he chose not to pursue. His maintenance of slavery was similarly not inevitable. Other leaders of his era came to question the institution, and Jackson's complete lack of moral reckoning with human bondage reflects a profound ethical failure. The movement to remove Jackson from the $20 bill, to reconsider his monuments and memorials, to teach his presidency with more attention to its victims, these are not efforts to erase history but to tell it more completely, to acknowledge that celebrating Jackson requires ignoring or minimizing suffering he deliberately caused. For Cherokee descendants, for Creek and Choctaw and Chickasaw and Seminole people whose ancestors walked the Trail of Tears, Jackson is not a complicated figure but a simple one, the architect of genocide, the man who broke treaties and destroyed nations in service of American expansion. The Hermitage still stands today, preserved as a museum and historical site, the plantation house maintained as it was in Jackson's time, the grounds carefully tended, the slave quarters restored to show how enslaved people lived and worked. Visitors can walk through Jackson's home, see the furniture and possessions he accumulated, stand by the grave where he and Rachel are buried side by side. The site tells his story, though increasingly it also tells the stories of those he enslaved, those he displaced, those who suffered under his policies. It is a place of memory, but whose memories are centered matters greatly. In the garden, not far from Jackson's grave, there is now a marker for the enslaved people who lived and died at the Hermitage, whose labor built and maintained the plantation, whose names were often not recorded but whose existence shaped everything about Jackson's life. It is a small gesture toward acknowledging the fuller truth of the place, toward recognizing that the prosperity Jackson enjoyed was built on bondage, that his retirement and comfort was made possible by people who had no freedom, no choice, no opportunity to tell their own stories. The question of how to remember Andrew Jackson admits no easy answers. He was genuinely transformative, genuinely significant, genuinely representative of forces and contradictions that defined his era and still echo in ours. He expanded democracy while embodying its deepest failures. He championed the common man while perpetuating systems of oppression that denied humanity to millions. He believed deeply in American greatness while ensuring that greatness came at a terrible cost to those defined as outside the American project. Perhaps what is most unsettling about Andrew Jackson is not that he was uniquely evil but that he was not, that his combination of genuine democratic impulses and profound moral blindness was not aberrational but representative, that millions of Americans have shared his worldview even as others have fought against it, that the contradictions he embodied remain unresolved in American life. The tension between democracy and oppression, between popular will and constitutional limits, between national expansion and human rights, these were Jackson's conflicts, and they are ours still. He lived in a time of violence and died in comfort, having inflicted more suffering than he endured, having shaped a nation more through destruction than creation. He was mourned by thousands and cursed by thousands more, celebrated as a hero by those whose interests he advanced and remembered as a monster by those whose lives he destroyed. History has not resolved these competing narratives but has instead deepened them, as each generation finds in Andrew Jackson a reflection of its own struggles with power, democracy, and the meaning of justice. The night has carried us through his life, from the orphaned boy in the Waxhaws to the dying president at the Hermitage, through battles and duels and political triumphs and human catastrophes. We have walked beside him through blood and fire, through his rage and his tenderness, through his victories and the terrible costs of those victories. And now, as his story ends, we are left with questions that have no simple answers, with a legacy so complex and contradictory that it resists neat categorization. Was Andrew Jackson a great president? By measures of political impact and historical significance, undeniably yes. Did his greatness require or at least produce immense suffering? Also yes. Can we celebrate his expansion of democracy without reckoning with his ethnic cleansing and his slaveholding? History says we cannot, though for many years we tried. Can we condemn his worst acts without acknowledging that millions of Americans supported them, that he was not an aberration but an embodiment of popular will? We cannot do that either, not honestly. What remains is the obligation to see him fully, to understand him completely, to neither excuse his crimes nor deny his significance. Andrew Jackson was terrifying not because he was a monster. Monsters are easy to identify and oppose. He was terrifying because he was human, because he embodied contradictions that were and are deeply American, because the same democratic energy that empowered ordinary white men was channeled into policies that destroyed native nations and preserved slavery. He was terrifying because he won, because his vision of America triumphed even as its costs became undeniable, because we still live in the nation he helped create, still grapple with the tensions he embodied but never resolved. The Hermitage garden is quiet now, the graves undisturbed, the tulip poplars Rachel planted still standing after nearly 2 centuries. Visitors come and go, some seeking inspiration from his story, others seeking understanding of how such suffering could be inflicted in democracy's name. The house stands as he left it, frozen in time, a monument to a man who would not accept limits, who believed his will was sufficient to overcome any obstacle, who bent the nation to his vision through force of personality and ruthless determination. And somewhere, in memory and in consequence, the trail of tears continues, the forced march that never truly ends because its effects compound through generations, because cultural destruction is not a single event but an ongoing loss, because the choices Andrew Jackson made ripple forward through time, shaping lives and limiting possibilities for people who never knew his name but who live with the consequences of his power. This is the story of Andrew Jackson, the most terrifying man ever elected president, terrifying not for his cruelty alone but for his popularity, not for his failures but for his successes, not for being unlike America but for being so deeply, troublingly representative of it. As dawn approaches and this long night ends, his story offers no comfort, no easy lessons, no simple morals. Only the complicated truth of a complicated man who shaped a complicated nation, whose legacy demands our attention precisely because it refuses our judgment, whose life raises questions we must continue asking even when the answers remain elusive. The night releases us now, and Andrew Jackson recedes into history, neither hero nor villain but both and neither, a man who lived and died and left behind a nation transformed, for better and worse, by his presence. May we remember him fully. May we learn from him honestly. And may we never forget those who suffered under his power, whose stories deserve to be told alongside his, whose humanity demands recognition even when history tried to erase them. Rest now. The story is complete. And in the morning, we will wake to a world still shaped by choices made long ago, still grappling with legacies we inherit whether we choose them or not, still trying to build something better from the materials history has left us.